So, Ozzy, when I state in my blog post on this subject of how black classical music was, as I say, the stepchild of the Harlem Renaissance, because before then, the black performers and composers who wanted to compose in the classical tradition were trying to break into a white genre that was zealously preserved by the white music establishment as a whites only preserve. And as a result, many of them were slapped down or basically go compose your own kind of music, colored music. What is your problem with that argument?
Well, let's look at it from a broader historical perspective. I think a lot of times when we approach these, we tend to do look at them from sort of the whites only perspective. With particular regard to the Harlem Renaissance, yes, I think when we talk about the term Harlem Renaissance, we talk about the things that were happening in that time. But again, the black classical tradition comes beyond that. They were bringing what they had learned in terms of classical music to the Harlem Renaissance.
They who?
So when we're talking about the composers, look, for example, Duke Ellington, look at William Dawson, look at William Grant Still, the people even that you identify, Black Swan, that music was there. They were learning the classical music instruments. That's how jazz was able to incorporate things like the upright bass. So there's a history there that bespeaks a broader scope in terms of where this music comes from. So yes, my problem with the article is mostly that it centers around the focus of white oppression and the struggle to break into that has somehow pivotal to the discovery of classical or classical style music for black people, and that's not the truth. We had that before the white influence. It's just that in terms of being successful in America, yes, they had to navigate that. But I would much rather talk about the music itself as opposed to just focus on the story of struggle or even contextualize the struggle as somehow an origin piece. It's not a stepchild.
There were even successful African American performers in the 19th century within the classical tradition. I mentioned Sister Retta Jones in the article, and then this woman after whom Black Swan was named, and there are others. And then there were these hybrids that came out where there were people who made their living performing partially classical music, but also partially bringing on the popular music of the day. It was this hybrid mix show. So, for one thing, there wasn't the strict separation of genres that we have today. You go to. I don't really know what the history of black composers and performers are in other countries. The virulent racism of American culture was particularly oppositional and saw classical music as a white preserve, and put those barriers up quite high. And so the ones who either succeeded, the few who succeeded in overcoming those barriers, or the many others who succumbed, that was a narrative that they couldn't ignore. They couldn't say, it's our tradition, we're claiming what's ours. They couldn't make a living at it. I understand what you're saying. I said, I'm so tired of this story. I'm so tired of this narrative. That doesn't make it any less true.
It doesn't make it less true, but does it have to be retold? That's the real question that we're asking ourselves, because we, as the current arbiters of history, have an obligation to explain the story to generations. And I think a lot of times when you explain the story, but you only provide it in one context, you implicitly bias those who are learning about that narrative. And I think for black composers, black musicians, black people, as we learn about this history, I think we owe it to ourselves to try to discover it beyond the lens of white supremacy. Certainly that has been there, but even if you want to look at, for example, William Grant Still assembling a black orchestra together to perform the music, No, he might have not been able to get it performed, by white symphonies at the time.
Actually, he was the first to do so.
But you see what I'm saying?
Right.
But before that, there was his own agency, and there was the agency of other composers. So, us learning it from that lens gives us the chance to see that we were able to do it on our own. That it's something that we can take ownership outside of a system of privilege or prestige that's really been added to it afterwards, but there for so long that it's being claimed as the historical,
Right.
truth,
Right.
but it's not the truth. That's just the way it has been since it was co-opted by that system. So, that's a part of our history, but that's not our own history.
That point is well taken. But I think that, and just to reiterate, if I understand you correctly, even the story that I'm telling, as sympathetic as I try to be towards the black performers, is told through the lens of white oppression and overcoming. And that is a story that's told time and time again about African American endeavor and achievement in any number of fields. You want to see the story told from the view of black creativity and black agency, and not so much about, this is the door I had to beat down.
Right.
I get that. I think that there are two things that need to happen for this discussion to become more nuanced on a general level. The first is that African Americans need to learn about their own musical history. A lot of them don't know who William Grant Still is, or the contribution of classical music to the creation of popular music. In the case of Will Marion Cook, for example, or J. Rossman Johnson, who used what they learned in Europe and in the composition schools to elaborate and extend the ragtime genre, the ragtime that they inherited. And it wasn't just like extending them in terms of, classical works of composition, which some of them made the attempt to do, but complexities within the genre itself. And you need a certain amount of musical background in order to have that discussion to even make that kind of distinction. Because you have composers coming from the people who never studied classical music, who had hits of the day, and that was the humus, the ground, the forest floor of jazz. Okay, Louis Armstrong's a genius, absolutely groundbreaking. He never studied musical theory. He didn't, he may have taken it in through his ears and put it out through his trumpet, but he did not have classical elaborations of what he was doing.
So let's talk about this. I think the word classical is also a part of the discussion. Because when we think about classical music, we do think about training. I think the training is actually a consequence, though, of the music itself. And the style that we associate with classical, that discipline, is a very improvisatory art form. So Bach improvised, Beethoven improvised, Mozart improvised. There are stories about them improvising at their concerts.
Yeah, but what we inherit is what's written down.
Right, but what's written down again is the derivative of something that was normally improvised by the composer. So now when we're talking about the true genius of classical music, we're talking about the aesthetic of improvisation. We're talking about the form of music that is beyond the rules. And that is something that has been with Black people, even if you want to talk about jazz. So if you listen to jazz is as complicated as, what is traditionally considered classical music. The nuance and the character of that music is no less complicated or, highbrow as any other form of music that's been notated. It just has the beauty that it's so amazing and it's in the moment. It can't be notated. But hence we have the technology of recorded music, and we begin to change the game in that way. So what we have in classical music, we have in other forms of music. And classical music is not the origin of that aesthetic. It's just one place where it happens to be written down in a particular way. And so if we're going to talk about classical music, are we making the distinction between the beauty of the form, or is it, the designation of a period or a particular type of medium in terms of publishing?
I actually think there's a very good point. There's a very good point between the traditions of composed music and what is required in order to master that tradition and what is improvised on the spot. It's interesting to see how Wynton Marsalis, for example, wants to turn jazz into a form of classical music, by recreating in arranged forms, famous jazz pieces from the past. That's a controversial stance, but it's one that he's taken. And of course, all music is improvised at the beginning because the composer has to improvise if nothing else. But they're in classical, in the classical tradition, you have the sort of rare moments where the credenzas, for example, it's like, okay, you've got 3 minutes to do your thing, and it's not composed, right? Mm-hmm. But everything else is notated on the paper. Mm-hmm. And then you have these competitions, piano competitions, where everybody's playing the same piece, everybody's playing the same notes. How's the attack? Where's how is the touch? It's the subtlety, but the notes are the same.
So the notes though are a transcription of the improvisation. I think it's a great testament to people who can play what has been notated by some of the great composers. That is a particular type of skill set, but that's the difference. Same difference between being an actor, on the stage who can deliver a script, and being the author of that script. The authoring of the script isn't the same thing as the performance aesthetic.
Amen.
I think in terms of classical music, I think we've come to associate, the performance aesthetic as somehow being representative of the form apart from improvisation. And my argument is that, no, the form is improvisation. It's just a crystallized form of it. It's the form that others can emulate, but it's not to be compared to the form from which it comes from the original composer, which can be emulated. Which is why, when we have these jazz recordings that are just brilliant, we're blown away. It would be, imagine if you transcribe that performance though, and now for hundreds of years afterwards, people try to play
happening already.
The Oscar Peterson transcriptions, and there are Oscar's transcriptions, and I know people who've learned how to play them just like a Chopin etude, and they're just as complicated. They're just as brilliant to that aesthetic form. So that's what I'm saying. It's the improvisation is there in the notation.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
That I'm making too much of a distinction between the score that's performed on stage and the improvisation behind the score, and what's actually how the score itself is a basis for improvisation, but kind of in a different way with on different levels. But that happens in jazz as well. A perfect example of that is West End Blues, the famous Louis Armstrong, when he recorded with King Oliver, and he's got this 1 minute trumpet solo that just everybody, because he's a genius, right? Everybody who heard it at the time said, "What was that?" transcribed it and they learned how to play it. And from that went into their own improvisations. So that created the Traz tradition. So it was a combination, actually, of improvisation and notation.
And see, I think this is probably something that needs to happen and be transformed in classical music education, because we're teaching it the other way around. We're teaching that somehow there's some magic in the notation, the intervallics there that produces the aesthetics of classical music. When it was always improvisation, it was always the inclination of the student to just go on the piano and begin to play. That's the true birthplace of music, and all the composers really start there. And then they give us this other form that becomes what's glorified. But that's sort of like it's a crystallization. That's the best way I can.
But it's also necessary because you have to your piece, Song for Humanity.
Oh, wow.